I stood outside the law office watching through glass doors as my 3 sons and daughters-in-law sat around a mahogany table with the family attorney. I clutched a manila folder against my chest, remembering how they barred me from my own husband's funeral just 1 week ago. The lawyer's shocked expression when he opens my folder. My sons' faces draining of color. "This meeting is only for the heirs named in the will," they had said with cruel smiles. Little did they know what 43 years of marriage had taught me about their father. My name is Lynette, and for 62 years, I thought I understood what family meant. I married Harold when I was 19, fresh out of nursing school, with dreams of helping people heal. Instead, I spent the next 4 decades healing my own family, pouring every ounce of my energy into making sure my husband and 3 sons had everything they needed to succeed. Harold was 25 when we met working nights as a paralegal while studying for his law degree during the day. I remember how his eyes would droop with exhaustion during our coffee dates, how he'd apologize for falling asleep mid-conversation. Without hesitation, I took a job at the county hospital working double shifts to support us both while he focused on his studies. We lived in a tiny studio apartment above Mrs. Chen's grocery store, sharing a hot plate and a bathroom down the hall with 3 other tenants. Our first son, Brandon, arrived 2 years into our marriage. Harold was in his final semester, and I was working nights in the emergency room. I'd come home at dawn, nurse Brandon, catch 3 hours of sleep, then wake up to care for him while Harold studied. Tyler came along 18 months later, followed by Garrett 2 years after that. By the time Harold passed the bar exam, we had 3 boys under the age of 5, and I hadn't worked a full shift in months. Harold started as a junior associate at Peterson Wright, and associates earning barely enough to cover our rent in a 2-bedroom duplex across town. I stretched every dollar clipping coupons, shopping clearance sales, making Halloween costumes from old bed sheets. The boys wore hand-me-downs from church donations, and I cut their hair myself on the back porch every few weeks. But Harold was brilliant, and his dedication paid off. Within 5 years, he'd made partner. Within 10, he'd bought out the senior partners and renamed the firm Jenkins and Associates. By the time Brandon graduated high school, Harold owned the most prestigious law practice in our mid-sized Ohio town, handling estate planning and corporate law for the wealthiest families in 3 counties. As Harold's success grew, so did our lifestyle. We moved into a sprawling colonial on Maple Street, complete with a circular driveway swimming pool and enough space for each boy to have his own bedroom and bathroom. Harold bought me a new Cadillac every other year, insisted I hire a housekeeper, and encouraged me to join the country club. But somewhere along the way, my boys changed. Brandon, now 41, had followed his father into law, graduating from Northwestern, and joining a corporate firm in Columbus. He married Stephanie, the daughter of a federal judge, in a lavish ceremony that cost more than Harold and I had made in our first 5 years together. Brandon wore $1,000 suits, drove a BMW, and spoke to me with the same polite distance he used with his secretary. Tyler, 39, had gone into real estate development, building luxury subdivisions throughout central Ohio. His wife Courtney came from old money, her family owning half the commercial properties downtown. Tyler had developed an obsession with status symbols, constantly upgrading his house, his cars, his golf club memberships. He'd started calling me by my first name instead of Mom when he turned 30. Garrett, the baby, at 37, worked as an investment banker in Cincinnati. His wife Jasmine was sharp as a tack, a financial advisor who'd built her own client base before they married. Garrett had always been my sensitive child, but marriage to Jasmine had hardened him. He'd begun calculating the value of everything, including family relationships. The 3 couples visited less and less over the years. Holiday gatherings became obligatory appearances where they'd arrive late, leave early, and spend most of their time checking phones or discussing business deals. When they did talk to me, it was with barely concealed impatience, as if my questions about their lives were interruptions to more important matters. 6 months ago, Harold was diagnosed with pancreatic cancer. The oncologist gave us a prognosis of 6 to 8 months, maybe longer with aggressive treatment. I immediately rearranged our entire home to accommodate Harold's needs, converting the downstairs den into a bedroom so he wouldn't have to climb stairs. I learned to manage his medications, coordinate with hospice nurses, and handle the endless insurance paperwork. I called each of our sons to explain the situation, begging them to spend time with their father while they still could. Brandon visited twice in 6 months, staying less than an hour each time, claiming urgent court deadlines. Tyler managed 3 visits, but spent most of his time on conference calls in Harold's study. Garrett came by 4 times, always bringing Jasmine, who sat in the corner, calculating something on her tablet, while I tried to facilitate conversations between father and son. Harold never complained about their absence, but I saw the disappointment in his eyes every time he'd ask me to call one of them, only to reach voicemail. He'd dictate messages I'd leave on their phones, updates about treatments, requests for visits, invitations to family dinners that went unanswered. On a rainy Tuesday morning in March, Harold died peacefully in his sleep. I was sitting beside his bed holding his hand when his breathing simply stopped. For a moment, the house was completely silent, except for the soft ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, the same clock Harold had bought to celebrate Brandon's birth. I sat there for 20 minutes, memorizing the lines of Harold's face, whispering 43 years worth of thank yous and I love yous. Then with shaking hands, I picked up the phone to call our boys. Brandon answered on the first ring, unusual for him during business hours. When I told him his father had passed, his first words were, "Have you contacted anyone else yet? Don't call the funeral home or make any arrangements until we get there. We need to coordinate everything properly." "No, I'm sorry for your loss." "No, are you okay, Mom?" Just immediate concern about controlling the situation. Within 3 hours, all 3 sons and their wives had descended on the house like a perfectly organized task force. They brought laptops, legal pads, and an efficiency that felt more like a hostile takeover than a family gathering to mourn their father. Brandon took charge immediately, which shouldn't have surprised me. As the eldest and only lawyer among my sons, he'd always been the natural leader. But the Brandon who walked into my house that day wasn't the little boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard, or the teenager who'd written me heartfelt Mother's Day cards. This was a stranger wearing my son's face, speaking with clinical detachment about arrangements and logistics. "Mother, we've discussed this among ourselves on the drive over," Brandon announced, settling into Harold's favorite recliner without asking. Stephanie positioned herself beside him, her designer handbag placed strategically on the coffee table like a territorial marker. "Given your emotional state and the complexity of Dad's affairs, we think it's best if we handle the funeral arrangements. You shouldn't have to worry about those details right now." Tyler and Courtney had claimed the sofa, Tyler already scrolling through his phone, while Courtney examined our family photos with the calculating gaze of someone appraising real estate. Garrett and Jasmine stood near the window, whispering in low voices that carried the unmistakable tone of business negotiations. "I appreciate your concern," I replied carefully, "but your father and I discussed his preferences years ago. He wanted a simple service at First Methodist burial at Greenwood Cemetery beside his parents." "That was before his practice became what it is today," Tyler interjected without looking up from his phone. "Dad was a prominent figure in this community. The funeral needs to reflect that status appropriately." Courtney nodded in agreement. "We've already contacted Morrison Funeral Home, the one that handled my grandmother's service. They have experience with high-profile families. Jasmine spoke up from the window. We'll need to consider the guest list carefully. Harold's client base includes some very important people who'll expect proper acknowledgement. I felt like I was watching a play where everyone knew their lines except me. Your father specifically said he didn't want anything elaborate. He wanted close family and friends to gather and remember him simply. Mother, you're grieving, Brandon said with the patronizing tone he might use with a confused witness. You're not thinking clearly about the bigger picture. Dad built something significant in this town. His funeral is going to be a public event whether we plan it that way or not. It's better to maintain control of the narrative. The phrase, control the narrative, hit me like a slap. My husband of 43 years had been dead for less than 4 hours, and my sons were already talking about managing public perception. Over the next 3 days, I watched my boys transform our home into a command center for an operation that had nothing to do with honoring their father's memory. They commandeered Harold's office, spreading documents across his desk, making phone calls, scheduling meetings with people I'd never heard of. Stephanie took over the kitchen, ordering catering from an upscale restaurant downtown, instead of accepting the casseroles and home-cooked meals that neighbors had started bringing by. We need to think about presentation, she explained when I questioned the expense. People will judge the family based on details like food quality. Tyler spent hours on his laptop designing what he called a proper program for the service. Instead of the simple memorial Harold had requested, Tyler created an elaborate booklet featuring Harold's professional achievements photographs from bar association events and testimonials from clients. Missing entirely were the personal touches that would have mattered to Harold, pictures of family camping trips, stories about teaching his sons to fish, memories of quiet Sunday mornings, reading the newspaper together. Courtney appointed herself coordinator of flower arrangements, dismissing the modest bouquets I'd selected in favor of elaborate displays that cost more than our first car. Harold Jenkins deserves flowers that make a statement, she declared, as if my husband's worth could be measured in the height of gladioli stems. Garrett and Jasmine focused on what they called logistics management, which seemed to involve a lot of whispered conversations about guest seating, parking arrangements, and something they referred to as the reception situation. When I asked about their plans, Jasmine showed me a spreadsheet she'd created categorizing attendees by their potential importance to the family's ongoing interests. The morning of the funeral, I woke early to iron the navy dress Harold had always said brought out my eyes. I'd planned to spend a quiet hour with coffee and the photo albums, remembering better times before the service began. Instead, I found my kitchen full of strangers arranging catered breakfast items I hadn't ordered. Who authorized this? I asked Tyler, who was directing the caterers like a general positioning troops. We did, he replied without looking at me. Important people will be coming by the house before the service. We need to be prepared to host them properly. This is my home, I said, my voice rising despite my efforts to stay calm. Your father is lying at the funeral home and you're turning our kitchen into a business reception. Courtney looked up from her phone where she'd been coordinating something urgent enough to justify ignoring my distress. Lynette, you need to understand that today isn't just about personal grief. Harold's reputation affects all of us. Everything needs to be perfect. The casual use of my first name delivered with the dismissive tone usually reserved for service staff crystallized something cold and hard in my chest. These weren't my children anymore. They were strangers who happened to share my DNA, treating me like an inconvenient relative at their networking event. At Morrison Funeral Home, I discovered they'd seated me in the second row. The front row was reserved for Harold's business partners and their wives, people he'd known for a decade at most. When I questioned the arrangement, Brandon explained that the seating reflected the natural hierarchy of Harold's professional relationships. I was his wife for 43 years, I said quietly. And that's why you have a place of honor in the second row, Stephanie replied, adjusting my corsage as if I were a child who couldn't dress herself. The front row is for the colleagues who'll be speaking about Dad's professional legacy. During the service, I sat surrounded by virtual strangers, while acquaintances delivered prepared remarks about Harold's legal achievements. No one mentioned his laugh, his terrible jokes, his habit of leaving love notes in my lunch bag. No one talked about the man who'd held my hand through 3 difficult pregnancies, who'd painted the nursery a different color for each son, who'd cried harder than I did when each boy left for college. The receiving line after the service became the final insult. Brandon, Tyler, and Garrett positioned themselves at the front of the church, accepting condolences with the practiced grace of politicians working a fundraiser. Their wives stood beside them, playing the role of grieving family members with convincing performances. I stood to the side, invisible and forgotten, watching strangers offer sympathy to my sons about the father they'd barely bothered to visit. When old friends approached me directly, Brandon would quickly redirect their attention, explaining that the family appreciated their support and would be in touch soon about memorial donations. At Greenwood Cemetery, the final betrayal came as they lowered Harold's casket into the earth beside his parents' graves. I approached the graveside for one last private moment with my husband, carrying the single white rose I'd brought from our garden, the same variety he'd planted for our 20th anniversary. Brandon stepped directly into my path, his 6-foot frame blocking my access to the grave. "The family needs space right now, Mother. Please step back." The family, as if I weren't part of it. As if 43 years of marriage, 3 childbirths, countless sleepless nights, and unwavering devotion had somehow disqualified me from the definition of family. I clutched my white rose and stepped back, watching from 10 feet away as dirt covered the casket containing the only man who'd ever loved me unconditionally. In that moment, standing alone while my sons comforted each other, I realized that Harold hadn't just died. The family I'd spent decades nurturing had died with him, replaced by something cold and calculating that I no longer recognized. As the cemetery workers began their final task, I heard Tyler murmur to Courtney, "Once we get through the will reading, we can finally move forward with our plans." The will reading. In all my grief, I'd forgotten that Harold's legal affairs would need to be settled. In that moment, watching my sons comfort each other while excluding me from the circle of family mourners, I realized I had no idea what those plans might be. But I was about to find out. I returned home after the cemetery service to find my sons and their wives gathered in Harold's study. The door closed, their voices carrying the urgent tone of people conducting business. I stood in the hallway for a moment, listening to fragments of conversation about asset distribution and property valuations and timeline considerations. When I knocked and entered, the room fell silent. Documents were spread across Harold's mahogany desk, the same desk where he'd helped each boy with homework 20 years ago. Now it looked like a corporate conference room covered with financial statements, property deeds, and legal papers I didn't recognize. "We're just getting a preliminary understanding of Dad's affairs," Brandon explained, gathering the papers into neat stacks. "The attorney will handle the formal reading next week, but we wanted to understand the scope of things." "These are Harold's private papers," I said, recognizing bank statements from accounts I'd never seen before. "Shouldn't we wait for the official process?" Garrett looked uncomfortable, shuffling his feet near the window. "We're not changing anything, Mom. We're just trying to understand what Dad left behind so we can help you navigate everything." Jasmine touched his arm, a subtle reminder that seemed to straighten his resolve. "The financial picture is quite complex, Lynette. Harold's practice, the real estate holdings, the investment accounts. It's probably more than you want to deal with during your grief. Tyler was examining Harold's diplomas on the wall as if seeing them for the first time. We've scheduled the will reading for next Thursday at 10 in the morning. Brandon's arranged for representation through his firm since there might be some complicated legal aspects. I should probably have my own attorney present. I said, though, I'd never needed a lawyer for anything more complicated than updating our house deed. The silence that followed my suggestion lasted just a beat too long. Stephanie cleared her throat delicately. The reading is really just a formality, Mother. Harold would have discussed any important provisions with you before he passed. But Harold hadn't discussed his will with me. In 43 years of marriage, we'd talked about everything from our children's college choices to our retirement dreams, but somehow the subject of inheritance had never come up directly. I'd assumed the way wives do that we'd face those decisions together when the time came. After the family left, I wandered through our house feeling like a stranger in my own home. Evidence of my son's search was subtle, but unmistakable filing cabinet drawers that didn't quite close properly, books on Harold's shelves, pushed back unevenly desk drawers that had been opened and closed by unfamiliar hands. Harold's home office had been his sanctuary, a place where he'd retreat after difficult days to read legal journals or work on cases that required extra attention. The room smelled like his cologne and the leather-bound law books that lined two walls. His coffee mug still sat on the desk holding the residue of his last cup 3 days before he died. I sat in his chair running my hands over the desk blotter where he'd written countless notes and noticed something odd. The brass letter opener he'd received as a law school graduation gift was missing. Harold had used it every day to open mail a small ritual that marked the transition from personal time to professional work. More concerning were the empty spaces in his filing system. Harold was meticulous about record-keeping, organizing documents with the same precision he'd applied to legal briefs, but several folders were missing from the section where he kept our personal financial records. I remembered Harold mentioning a personal safe years ago installed behind the false back of his bookshelf after a rash of burglaries in our neighborhood. I'd forgotten about it completely until that moment standing in his violated office, realizing that my sons might not know about his most private storage. The safe was exactly where I remembered, hidden behind a panel that opened when I pressed the correct sequence Harold had shown me once the birthdays of our 3 sons. Inside, I found documents that made my hands tremble as I read them. The first item was a will dated just 2 months ago, prepared by Margaret Walsh, an attorney I'd never heard of. As I read the provisions, my understanding of everything I thought I knew about my life shifted like a house foundation cracking during an earthquake. Harold had left everything to me. Everything. The house, the law, practice, the investment accounts, the real estate holdings. The will included specific language about our sons, acknowledging them as his children while explaining that their recent behavior had demonstrated they were sufficiently established in their own careers and marriages to require no further financial support from their father's estate. But it was the letter underneath the will that broke my heart and opened my eyes simultaneously. My dearest Lynette, Harold had written in his careful handwriting, "If you're reading this, then I'm gone, and you've discovered what our sons have become. I pray that I'm wrong about their intentions, but I fear I've seen enough to know that the boys we raised with such love have been replaced by strangers who view family relationships as business transactions." Harold's letter continued for 3 pages, detailing observations he'd made over the past 2 years, phone conversations he'd overheard between Tyler and investment advisors discussing upcoming inheritance opportunities, comments Stephanie had made about property that would be much more valuable without such outdated furnishings, Garrett's questions about the law practice's client base and whether it might be streamlined for a more profitable operation. Most devastating was Harold's account of a conversation he'd witnessed between Brandon and Tyler outside the country club 6 months ago, where they discussed waiting for the old man to finally kick off so we can liquidate everything and invest the money properly. I realized that somewhere along the way, we failed to teach them the difference between success and greed, Harold had written. They see our life's work as assets to be monetized rather than foundations to be respected. I will not allow them to treat you the way they've begun treating me as an obstacle to their financial advancement. The letter explained Harold's decision to transfer most of our assets into protective arrangements working with Margaret Walsh to ensure that I'd be provided for regardless of what our sons might attempt. He'd been planning to tell me everything after his treatments concluded, hoping he'd have enough time to help me understand the legal complexities. At the bottom of the safe, I found a small digital recorder and a file folder marked Evidence. Harold had been documenting our son's behavior methodically, like the attorney he was preparing for a case he'd hoped he'd never have to make. Inside the folder were bank records, showing unauthorized access to accounts at Harold's law firm real estate documents, indicating Tyler had been using client information for his development projects, an investment statement suggesting Garrett had been steering Harold's clients toward his own financial services without proper disclosure. The digital recorder contained Harold's voice weak from illness, but clear in purpose, detailing dates and times when each of our sons had crossed ethical and legal boundaries. He'd documented phone calls, overheard conversations, and incidents of behavior that painted a picture of 3 young men who'd lost their way completely. Lynette. Harold's recorded voice said in the final entry made just 3 weeks before his death. I hope you never have to hear this. But if you do, please know that everything I've done has been to protect you and to preserve some dignity for our family name. Our boys have made choices that put them beyond our help, but you deserve better than they're planning to give you. I sat in Harold's chair until well past midnight, reading and rereading the documents, listening to his voice on the recorder, understanding finally that the man I'd loved for 43 years had spent his final months preparing to protect me from our own children. The next morning, I called Margaret Walsh. Margaret turned out to be a woman near my own age who'd known Harold professionally for over 20 years. Her law office was smaller than Harold's, located in a converted Victorian house downtown, but her credentials were impeccable. She'd handled estate planning for several prominent families and had a reputation for meticulous attention to detail. Harold talked about you constantly, Margaret said as she served coffee from a silver service that belonged in someone's grandmother's dining room. He was so proud of the sacrifices you'd made for his career and your children. That's what made your son's behavior so heartbreaking for him. Margaret had been helping Harold document the evidence against our sons for months, she explained. As an officer of the court, Harold had felt obligated to report the financial irregularities he'd discovered, but as a father, he'd hoped to find a way to address the situation privately. He kept thinking he could find a way to reach them to help them understand that they were destroying their own lives, along with other people's, Margaret said. But the evidence kept getting worse. She showed me additional documentation Harold had provided, including client complaints about missing funds from real estate transactions Tyler had overseen, irregularities in investment advice Garrett had given to elderly clients, and questions about billing practices at Harold's firm that pointed to Brandon's involvement in systematic overbilling. Your husband contacted the FBI 6 weeks before he died, Margaret told me quietly. He couldn't stand watching his sons destroy the reputation he'd spent 40 years building. The investigation is already underway. The pieces were falling into place with terrible clarity. My sons hadn't just been dismissive and cruel during Harold's final months. They'd been actively criminal, using their father's illness as cover for stealing from his firm and his clients. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now we attend the will reading they've arranged and watch them hang themselves," Margaret replied with a smile that reminded me of Harold's expression when he'd outmaneuvered opposing counsel. "They're going to present you with a forged will that leaves everything to them, which will constitute several additional felonies. Meanwhile, we'll have representatives from the FBI and the State Bar Association waiting outside." "They're my children," I said, though the words felt hollow. "They stopped being children the moment they decided to steal from their dying father," Margaret replied. Harold understood that even if it broke his heart, he knew that the only way to stop them was to let them face the full consequences of their choices. I spent the weekend practicing the role Harold had written for me in his final, most important case. I would attend their will reading, let them believe they'd successfully deceived and cheated me, and then show them exactly what their father had thought of their behavior. For 43 years, I'd been Harold's devoted wife and our son's dedicated mother. Now it was time to be something else entirely, the instrument of justice my husband had prepared me to become. The week between discovering Harold's real will and the fake will, reading that my sons had arranged, became the longest and most challenging acting performance of my life. Every morning, I woke up knowing exactly what Brandon, Tyler, and Garrett were planning to do to me, and I had to pretend I suspected nothing. Brandon called daily with updates about preparations, speaking to me with the same patient condescension he might use with an elderly client suffering from dementia. "We're handling all the paperwork, Mother. You just focus on taking care of yourself during this difficult time." Tyler stopped by Wednesday afternoon with Courtney ostensibly to check on my well-being, but actually to conduct what felt like a property appraisal. While Tyler kept me occupied with forced conversation about grief counseling, Courtney wandered through the house taking pictures with her phone and making notes in a leather portfolio. "Just documenting things for insurance purposes," she explained when I asked about her activities. "With Harold gone, you'll want to make sure everything valuable is properly protected." Protected from whom, I wondered, but kept my expression neutral and grateful. Garrett's visit Thursday evening was the most difficult to endure. He brought dinner from my favorite restaurant downtown, the same place Harold had taken me for our anniversary every year. As we ate at my kitchen table, Garrett seemed almost like his old self, asking about my health, sharing memories of his father, expressing genuine concern about my future. "I want you to know that whatever happens with Dad's estate, we'll make sure you're taken care of, Mom," he said, reaching across to squeeze my hand. "You won't have to worry about money or where you'll live or anything like that." The kindness in his voice almost broke my resolve. For a moment, I wanted to believe that my youngest son still had some trace of the sweet boy who used to bring me dandelions from the yard. But then Jasmine emerged from the powder room where she'd been making phone calls, and Garrett's demeanor shifted immediately back to the careful politeness he'd perfected since his marriage. "We should probably discuss the practical arrangements," Jasmine said, settling into the chair beside Garrett and opening her tablet. "You'll want to start thinking about simplifying your living situation, Lynette. This house is far too large for one person, and the maintenance costs alone will eat up your resources." "My resources?" I asked carefully. "Whatever Harold left for your care," Garrett explained. "Dad was always generous, but he was also practical. He wouldn't have wanted you struggling to maintain a lifestyle you couldn't afford." Jasmine nodded approvingly. "We've researched some excellent senior living communities, places where you could have your own apartment but access to support services as you age. Very dignified options. Senior living communities." They were already planning to warehouse me in an assisted living facility, probably so they could sell my home and add the proceeds to their inheritance. The casual way they discussed dismantling my life while sitting at my kitchen table eating food paid for with money they planned to steal required every ounce of self-control I possessed. "That's very thoughtful," I managed to say. "I suppose I'll know more about my options after tomorrow's meeting." "About that," Garrett said, exchanging a glance with Jasmine. "You should probably prepare yourself for some disappointment, Mom. Dad's financial situation was more complicated than you might realize. The law practice has significant overhead, there are outstanding debts, and the real estate market hasn't been kind to property values." Jasmine leaned forward with the expression of someone delivering difficult but necessary news. Harold was successful, but supporting 3 sons through private colleges and graduate school, plus maintaining this lifestyle for decades, took a considerable toll on the estate. You'll be provided for, certainly, but you shouldn't expect anything extravagant. They were preparing me for poverty, I realized, setting up a narrative where Harold's estate had been depleted by family expenses, justifying whatever small allowance they planned to give me from money they intended to steal. Friday morning brought flowers from Brandon and Stephanie, an elaborate arrangement with a card reading, "Thinking of you during this difficult transition." Tyler sent a fruit basket with a note about, "Looking forward to helping you navigate the next chapter." Garrett called to ask if I needed a ride to the law office, offering to pick me up, "So you won't have to drive while you're emotional." I declined all their gestures of fake kindness, telling them I preferred to handle things independently. What I didn't tell them was that Margaret Walsh was picking me up in her car and that we'd be arriving at the law office with 2 very important folders that would change everything. Margaret arrived at 9:30 driving a practical sedan that wouldn't attract attention in the law office parking lot. She was dressed in her best court attire, a navy blue suit that projected authority and competence. In her briefcase, she carried copies of Harold's Real Will the Evidence folder documenting our son's criminal activities, and several additional documents I wouldn't see until we reached the meeting. "How are you holding up?" she asked, as we drove through the downtown traffic toward the law office where my sons were waiting. "I keep thinking about Harold," I said honestly. "He spent his last months watching our children become strangers and criminals, and he never said a word to me about how much it was hurting him." "He was protecting you," Margaret replied. "Harold knew that if he'd told you what he suspected, you would have tried to save them. He also knew that they'd gone too far for saving." The law office of Henderson Price and Associates occupied the top floor of the newest building downtown, all glass walls and chrome fixtures designed to impress clients with the firm's success. Brandon had arranged the meeting here rather than at Harold's office, claiming it would be more neutral and professional. As we rode the elevator to the 15th floor, Margaret handed me a small digital recorder barely larger than a matchbox. "Everything that happens in that room will be recorded," she said. "The FBI will want a complete transcript." The FBI. Even knowing Harold had contacted them, hearing the words in connection with my own children made my stomach clench with anxiety and grief. The receptionist directed us to a conference room where my sons and their wives were already seated around a polished table that could have accommodated 20 people. The lawyer they'd hired, a young associate named David Henderson, sat at the head of the table with several documents spread before him. Brandon stood when I entered, his manner formally cordial. "Mother, thank you for coming. I know this is difficult, but we'll try to keep things as simple as possible." Tyler and Garrett also rose, playing the roles of respectful sons, honoring their mother's presence. Their wives remained seated, Stephanie checking her phone, Courtney reviewing notes in a leather portfolio, Jasmine studying something on her tablet screen. "I've brought my attorney, Margaret Walsh," I announced, introducing Margaret to the group. "Harold mentioned her as someone who handles estate matters." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Henderson looked confused, checking his notes for reference to another attorney. Brandon's expression tightened almost imperceptibly. "That's not really necessary, Mother," Brandon said smoothly. "This is just a formality reading Dad's will aloud as required by law. There won't be any complex legal issues that need representation. Nevertheless, I'd prefer to have counsel present," I replied, taking the seat Margaret pulled out for me at the opposite end of the table from Henderson. For the next 20 minutes, Henderson read through a will that bore Harold's forged signature, but contained provisions that would have been completely contrary to everything my husband believed. According to the document, Harold had left the house to Tyler, the law practice to Brandon, the investment accounts to Garrett, and a modest trust fund to me that would provide approximately $1,500 per month for living expenses. The will included language expressing Harold's hope that his sons would use their inheritance wisely to build upon the foundation he had established, and his confidence that they would provide appropriate care for their mother during her remaining years. When Henderson finished reading, the room fell silent except for the soft hum of air conditioning and the distant sound of traffic 15 floors below. My sons watched me expectantly, waiting for tears, protests, or the confused questions of a woman who'd just discovered she'd been left nearly destitute. Instead, I opened my purse and removed the manila folder I'd carried from home. "I believe there may be some confusion," I said quietly, placing the folder on the conference table. "Harold prepared a different will, one that was witnessed and notarized according to Ohio state requirements." Henderson's face went pale as I opened the folder and removed Harold's real will, the one that left everything to me and acknowledged our sons only to specifically exclude them from inheritance due to their criminal behavior. "This is impossible," Brandon said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Actually, it's quite possible," Margaret said, speaking for the first time since introductions. "Harold Jenkins contacted me 8 months ago to prepare his estate documents. Everything was executed properly and filed with the appropriate authorities." Tyler was staring at the document in my hands as if it were a venomous snake. "Where did you get this?" "From your father's safe, the one he installed years ago that you apparently didn't know about," I replied. "The same safe where he kept documentation of your criminal activities over the past 2 years. The silence that followed could have been cut with a knife. Garrett looked sick. Stephanie had stopped checking her phone, and Courtney was staring at me with naked hostility. "I don't know what you think you've discovered." Brandon began his lawyer's training, taking over, "but whatever documents you have are probably misunderstandings of perfectly legal business transactions, including the money you've been stealing from client trust accounts," I asked. "Or the real estate deals Tyler arranged using confidential information from your father's files, or the investment advice Garrett gave to elderly clients without disclosing his personal financial stake in the recommendations." Henderson was gathering his papers with the desperate efficiency of someone who'd just realized he'd been involved in document fraud. "I think this meeting needs to be postponed until everyone can consult with independent counsel." "I don't think it does," Margaret said pleasantly. She opened her briefcase and removed a second folder, this one marked with official-looking seals and letterheads. "My client has additional documents that need to be shared before anyone leaves this room." Margaret distributed copies of the evidence Harold had compiled, the federal investigation documents, and arrest warrants that had been prepared based on the information Harold had provided to authorities. As my sons read through the papers that detailed their crimes with legal precision, their faces went through a spectrum of expressions: confusion, disbelief, anger, and finally fear. "This is entrapment," Tyler said weakly. "This is justice," I replied, standing up from my chair. "Your father spent 8 months documenting your crimes because he couldn't stand watching you destroy the reputation he spent 40 years building. He hoped until the end that he could find a way to reach you to help you understand what you were doing to yourselves and to other people. Jasmine was reading through Garrett's investment fraud documentation with the clinical detachment of someone reviewing a failed business plan. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I found Harold's evidence the night after the funeral," I said. "The same night you kept me from saying goodbye to my husband at his graveside." Margaret checked her watch and moved toward the conference room door. "Federal agents should be arriving in approximately 10 minutes, she announced. "Anyone who wants to make phone calls should probably do so now." As if on cue, Stephanie, Courtney, and Jasmine all stood simultaneously and headed for the exit, their phones already in their hands. Whatever loyalty they'd felt toward their husbands apparently didn't extend to federal conspiracy charges. "Mom," Garrett said, his voice cracking like it had when he was 12 years old and in trouble. "We can fix this. We can pay back anything that went missing and make everything right." "It's too late for that," I replied, looking at the three strangers who had once been my beloved sons. "Your father gave you 8 months to make different choices. Instead, you used his illness as an opportunity to accelerate your criminal activities." Brandon was staring at the arrest warrant with his name on it, his legal training helping him understand exactly how much trouble they were in. "How could you do this to your own children?" "I didn't do anything," I said quietly. "You did this to yourselves, and you did it to your father while he was dying. I'm simply refusing to pretend it didn't happen." The federal agents arrived precisely on schedule. Special Agent Sarah Mitchell of the FBI's Financial Crimes Division entered the conference room with the quiet authority of someone who'd spent years building cases against white-collar criminals. Behind her came Agent Robert Hayes and 2 additional agents whose presence transformed the corporate meeting space into something that felt more like an interrogation room. "Brandon Jenkins, Tyler Jenkins, Garrett Jenkins," Agent Mitchell announced. "You're under arrest for federal wire fraud conspiracy to commit fraud and violations of federal banking regulations." The words seemed to echo in the sudden silence. Henderson, the young associate who'd been hired to read the forged will, was frantically gathering his papers while staying as far from my sons as the room's dimensions allowed. Agent Mitchell continued with the formal recitation of rights, while her colleagues positioned themselves strategically around the table. "You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Brandon found his voice first, his legal training overriding the shock of arrest. "I demand to know the specific charges and the evidence supporting them. Wire fraud in connection with the systematic theft of client funds from Jenkins and Associates," Agent Hayes replied, consulting a folder thick with documentation. "Conspiracy charges related to real estate transactions that utilized confidential client information, bank fraud involving the manipulation of trust account funds, and as of this morning, additional charges related to the forged will you just attempted to execute." Agent Mitchell looked directly at me. "Mrs. Jenkins, thank you for your cooperation in this investigation. Your husband's documentation proved invaluable in building our case." "Harold started this investigation," Tyler asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Your father contacted the FBI 8 months ago," Agent Hayes confirmed. "He'd discovered irregularities in his firm's client accounts and realized that family members were responsible. Mr. Jenkins provided extensive documentation and cooperated fully with our investigation until his death 3 weeks ago." The look of betrayal on Garrett's face would have broken my heart if I hadn't already read Harold's evidence of how systematically my youngest son had been stealing from elderly clients. "Dad was working with the FBI against us. Your father was upholding his oath as an attorney and his responsibilities as a citizen," Margaret said firmly. "He discovered criminal activity and reported it to the appropriate authorities exactly as the law requires." Agent Mitchell opened her briefcase and removed a stack of documents secured with rubber bands. We have 8 months of recorded conversations, copies of altered documents, bank records, showing unauthorized transfers, and witness testimony from 17 clients who were defrauded in various schemes involving all 3 defendants. Stephanie, Courtney, and Jasmine had fled the conference room when the federal agents arrived, but I could see them through the glass walls standing in the hallway, with their phones pressed to their ears, undoubtedly calling divorce attorneys and family members to begin damage control. The financial scope of the crimes exceeds $2.3 million, Agent Hayes announced. Client trust funds, real estate fraud, investment scams targeting elderly victims, and the systematic looting of your father's law practice over a period of 18 months. Tyler slumped in his chair as if the weight of the evidence was physically crushing him. We were going to pay it back. Everything was just temporary borrowing until our business deals came through. Theft is theft regardless of your intentions to repay, Agent Mitchell replied. And the evidence suggests that repayment was never actually planned. Your recorded conversations indicate a systematic approach to asset liquidation following your father's expected death. Brandon was studying the arrest warrant with the focused attention of someone looking for legal loopholes. I want to speak with my attorney before answering any questions. That's your right, Agent Hayes said. You'll have access to counsel after processing. In the meantime, you're all under arrest. As the federal agents began the process of formally arresting my 3 sons, I found myself remembering a day 25 years earlier when Brandon had been arrested for underage drinking during his senior year of high school. Harold and I had driven to the police station together, worried sick about our son's future, determined to help him learn from his mistake. Harold had sat Brandon down the next morning for a conversation about choices and consequences, about how single moments of poor judgment could derail entire lives if they weren't addressed properly. Brandon had seemed to understand, had written a letter of apology to the police officer involved, had done community service at a homeless shelter to make amends for his behavior. Somewhere between that teachable moment and today's federal arrest, we'd lost our son completely. Agent Mitchell approached me as her colleagues began the process of securing evidence and preparing my sons for transport. Mrs. Jenkins will need you to come to the federal building this afternoon to provide a formal statement and sign some additional paperwork. Will I need an attorney? I asked. You're not facing any charges, she assured me. You're a witness and a victim. Your husband's foresight in documenting everything and reporting the crimes protected you from any legal liability. Margaret gathered her papers and closed her briefcase. I'll accompany Mrs. Jenkins this afternoon to make sure everything is handled properly. As federal agents escorted my sons from the conference room, each of them tried to make eye contact with me one final time. Brandon's expression was defiant, as if he still believed he could argue his way out of the situation. Tyler looked devastated, finally understanding the scope of what he'd lost. Garrett appeared, broken tears streaming down his face as he whispered, "I'm sorry, Mom," while Agent Hayes guided him toward the door. "I'm sorry too," I replied, but I wasn't sure he heard me over the sound of his own sobbing. Henderson, the attorney who'd been hired to read the forged will, approached me hesitantly as the law enforcement personnel filed out of the room. "Mrs. Jenkins, I want you to know that I had no knowledge of any irregularities. My firm was simply hired to perform a standard will reading." "I believe you," I said, though I suspected he'd face his own professional consequences for failing to verify the authenticity of the documents he'd been asked to read. Margaret and I remained in the conference room for several minutes, after everyone else had left processing the finality of what had just occurred. Through the glass walls, I could see office workers in the hallway, drawn by the unusual activity of federal agents, arresting 3 men in expensive suits. "How do you feel?" Margaret asked. It was a question I'd been dreading because the honest answer was complicated beyond easy explanation. relief that Harold's justice had finally been served, grief that my children had chosen paths that led to federal prison, exhaustion from months of pretending I didn't know what they'd become, anger at the way they'd treated their dying father, sadness for the grandchildren I might never see again. "I feel like Harold can finally rest," I said eventually. "He spent his last months watching our sons destroy everything he'd worked for, and he died knowing they'd probably try to cheat me out of what he'd left for my security. Now they can't hurt anyone else the way they hurt him." Margaret nodded, understanding. "Harold talked about you constantly during our meetings. He was so proud of the sacrifices you'd made for your family, and so angry about the way your sons had begun treating you. Everything he did was to protect you and to preserve some dignity for your family name." As we prepared to leave the conference room, I took one last look at the table where my sons had planned to execute their final betrayal. The forged will was still lying there, Harold's signature expertly duplicated by someone who'd probably been paid handsomely for the criminal service. "What happens now?" I asked. "Now they face the consequences of their choices," Margaret replied. "And you begin the rest of your life as a woman of considerable means who doesn't have to worry about being cheated or manipulated by people who should have loved you." We rode the elevator down 15 floors in comfortable silence, two women who just witnessed the end of a family and the beginning of justice. As we walked through the lobby toward Margaret's car, I realized that for the first time in months, I felt safe. Harold's plan had worked perfectly. The local news coverage began that evening with a story that dominated headlines for weeks: prominent attorney's sons arrested in multi-million-dollar fraud scheme. The reporter standing outside the federal courthouse explained how Harold Jenkins, a respected member of the legal community, had cooperated with federal investigators to expose crimes committed by his own children. I watched the coverage from my living room, the same room where my sons had dismissed my concerns and excluded me from family decisions just days earlier. The irony wasn't lost on me that they were finally receiving the attention they'd always craved, just not in the way they'd intended. The financial destruction came swiftly and completely. Within 48 hours of their arrest, Brandon had been suspended from the Ohio State Bar, pending investigation and formal disbarment proceedings. His law firm immediately terminated his partnership and began their own internal investigation to determine the scope of his misconduct. Tyler's real estate empire collapsed like a house of cards when federal auditors discovered that multiple properties had been purchased using funds stolen from Harold's client accounts. The State Real Estate Commission suspended his license pending criminal trial, and his development company filed for bankruptcy protection when banks called in loans secured by assets that were now frozen as evidence. Garrett's investment firm faced immediate closure when federal regulators discovered that he'd been operating what amounted to a Ponzi scheme using new client investments to pay returns to existing clients while diverting substantial sums for personal use. 17 elderly clients, many of them referred by Harold's law practice, had lost their retirement savings to Garrett's fraudulent investment advice. But the personal destruction proved even more devastating than the professional consequences. Stephanie filed for divorce from Brandon before he'd spent 24 hours in federal custody. Her father, the federal judge who'd presided over their wedding, issued a public statement distancing his family from any connection to the criminal charges. Stephanie's divorce attorney moved quickly to protect her inherited assets, claiming she'd had no knowledge of her husband's criminal activities. Courtney's divorce from Tyler was announced in the society pages of the local newspaper, complete with quotes from her family about their shock and disappointment at being deceived by someone they'd trusted completely. Courtney's family owned significant commercial real estate in the downtown area, and they immediately began eviction proceedings against any tenant connected to Tyler's business operations. Jasmine's response to Garrett's arrest was perhaps the most calculating of all. Within a week, she'd liquidated their joint investment accounts, sold their house, and moved to Florida where her sister lived. Garrett's attempts to contact her from jail went unanswered, and her attorney informed his public defender that she was pursuing divorce on grounds of fraud and emotional distress. The three women who'd spent years treating me like an inconvenient burden suddenly found themselves facing financial ruin and social exile. Their participation in planning my exclusion from Harold's funeral and will reading had been captured by security cameras and witness testimony, making their claims of innocence difficult to maintain. Margaret Walsh handled the legal aspects of my inheritance with the same meticulous attention to detail she'd brought to building the criminal case against my sons. Harold's estate, valued at just over $8 million, transferred to me without complications. The law practice, the real estate holdings, the investment accounts, even the country club membership that had meant so much to my sons. All of it became mine to manage or dispose of as I saw fit. I decided to sell Harold's law practice to his longtime partner James Peterson, who'd been horrified to discover the extent of the criminal activity that had been occurring under his nose. James agreed to maintain the firm's name and reputation while implementing new safeguards to protect client funds. The sale provided additional resources for my planned charitable work. The real estate holdings, including rental properties and commercial buildings my sons had planned to liquidate, became the foundation for my new mission. Harold had always talked about establishing a charitable foundation someday, and I decided to honor that dream by creating the Harold Jenkins Foundation for Elder Protection. Working with Margaret's legal expertise and the advice of ethical financial advisors, I established programs to help elderly victims of financial crimes, provide legal assistance to seniors facing exploitation, and educate families about the warning signs of elder abuse. The Foundation's first major initiative provided support to the 17 clients who'd been defrauded by Garrett's investment schemes. 6 months after their arrest, my sons were sentenced in federal court. Brandon received 8 years in federal prison for wire fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. His disbarment from the Ohio State Bar became final, ending a legal career that had once held such promise. Tyler was sentenced to 6 years plus restitution requirements that would follow him for the rest of his life. The real estate properties he'd developed using stolen funds were sold to compensate victims, but the amounts recovered represented only a fraction of the total losses. Garrett received 5 years in federal prison, the lightest sentence of the three due to his cooperation with prosecutors and his obvious remorse. During his sentencing hearing, he read a letter apologizing to his victims and to me, acknowledging that greed had replaced the values Harold and I had tried to teach him. I attended each sentencing hearing, sitting in the gallery behind the prosecutor's table, watching as the judge delivered consequences that would define my sons' futures. Each of them looked back at me before being led away to begin their prison terms, and I tried to find some trace of the children they'd once been in the faces of the strangers they'd become. The community response varied widely. Old friends who'd attended Harold's funeral and witnessed my son's behavior rallied around me with support and understanding. They'd seen firsthand how I'd been excluded and dismissed, and they appreciated the courage it had taken to pursue justice rather than enable continued criminal behavior. But other community members struggled to understand how a mother could cooperate in sending her own children to prison. I received anonymous letters criticizing my choices, lost some friendships, and faced whispered conversations that stopped when I entered rooms. Margaret helped me process the complex emotions surrounding these social consequences. Harold understood that you'd face criticism for doing the right thing, she reminded me during one of our regular coffee meetings. But he also knew that you're strong enough to handle disapproval from people who don't understand the full situation. The country club where Harold and I had been members for 20 years became uncomfortable territory when other members began avoiding me or engaging in obviously strained conversations. I resigned my membership and found more meaningful social connections through volunteer work at the foundation and the cancer center where Harold had received treatment. 9 months after the arrests, I received a phone call from Brandon in federal prison. It was our first direct conversation since the day of his arrest, and his voice sounded older, rougher, stripped of the arrogant confidence he'd carried for years. "Mom, I need you to know that I understand why you did what you did," he said without preamble. "I've had time to think about Dad's last months about how we treated him and how we treated you. I'm ashamed of who I became." It was the first genuine expression of remorse I'd heard from any of my sons since their arrests. We talked for 20 minutes, a conversation that felt like speaking to someone I'd once known but hadn't seen in years. Brandon talked about prison programs he was participating in, books he was reading, letters he'd written to clients he'd cheated but hadn't yet found the courage to mail. "I keep thinking about Dad working with the FBI to stop us," he said near the end of our call. "How much it must have hurt him to realize that his own sons had become criminals. I wish I could apologize to him." "Your father loved you until the day he died," I told him honestly. "But he loved justice more than he loved enabling your bad choices. That's what made him a good man and a good attorney." Tyler and Garrett made similar calls over the following months. Tyler's conversation focused on the clients he'd cheated and the families who'd lost their homes when his development projects collapsed. Garrett talked about the elderly investors who'd trusted him with their life savings, describing sleepless nights when he thought about seniors who couldn't afford groceries because of his greed. These conversations didn't erase the damage they'd done or restore the family relationships that had been destroyed, but they suggested that federal prison might accomplish what decades of privilege and enabling had failed to achieve, forcing my sons to confront the consequences of their choices and the people they'd hurt along the way. The foundation grew steadily, providing services to hundreds of elderly victims of financial crimes while advocating for stronger legal protections. I testified before state legislative committees about the need for enhanced penalties for crimes against seniors, sharing Harold's documentation and my family's experience to illustrate how financial exploitation destroys families and communities. Harold's reputation, initially tarnished by association with his son's crimes, was gradually restored as the legal community learned about his cooperation with federal investigators and his efforts to protect clients from further harm. The State Bar Association established the Harold Jenkins Award for Ethical Courage, recognizing attorneys who report professional misconduct despite personal cost. 2 years after the arrests, I felt ready to consider what the rest of my life might look like. The grief for Harold remained constant, but it had evolved from sharp daily pain into a quieter sadness mixed with gratitude for 43 years of genuine love. The anger toward my sons had also evolved, replaced by acceptance that they'd made choices that put them beyond my ability to help or save. I was 64 years old, financially secure, and free from the obligation to enable destructive behavior from people who should have loved me. For the first time since I was 19 years old, my life belonged entirely to me. 3 years have passed since that morning when I stood outside the law office watching my sons plan to steal my inheritance. As I write this, I'm sitting in the garden behind my house, surrounded by the roses Harold planted for our 20th anniversary. The flowers bloom more beautifully now than they ever did when he was alive, as if his spirit is still nurturing the things he loved. The Harold Jenkins Foundation for Elder Protection has grown beyond anything I could have imagined when Margaret and I first discussed establishing it. We now operate in 6 Ohio counties, providing legal assistance, financial counseling, and emotional support to hundreds of elderly victims of fraud and abuse. The foundation's success has attracted national attention, and I've been invited to speak at conferences about elder protection across the country. Last month, I testified before a congressional subcommittee about the need for federal legislation protecting seniors from financial exploitation by family members. Sitting in that hearing room, sharing Harold's story and our family's experience, I felt his presence strongly. He would have been proud to see his documentation and sacrifice leading to meaningful legal reform. The Foundation's work has introduced me to remarkable people whose courage in the face of betrayal has inspired my own healing journey. Sarah Chen, an 82-year-old retired teacher whose nephew stole her retirement savings, became a Foundation volunteer and close friend. Marcus Johnson, a Korean War veteran cheated by his daughter-in-law's investment schemes, now helps other veterans navigate financial recovery resources. These survivors taught me that family betrayal follows predictable patterns. The isolation, the gaslighting, the gradual erosion of independence, the ultimate theft of resources meant to provide security in vulnerable years. But they also taught me that recovery is possible, that dignity can be restored, and that justice serves a purpose beyond simple punishment. I kept Harold's house but transformed it completely. The formal dining room became the Foundation's meeting space. Harold's study, where our sons had searched for financial documents to steal, now houses resources for families facing elder abuse. The living room, where my daughters-in-law had treated me like hired help, has been converted into a comfortable counseling space where trained volunteers help victims process their experiences. The country club membership I resigned in disgrace has been replaced by meaningful work at the Community Cancer Center, where Harold received treatment. I volunteer 2 days a week, providing support to families navigating the medical and emotional challenges of serious illness. The nursing skills I abandoned 43 years ago to support Harold's career have returned naturally, like muscle memory that never completely disappears. My sons have served their prison terms with varying degrees of personal growth. Brandon was released last year after serving 6 years of his 8-year sentence. He's working as a paralegal in Cincinnati, prohibited from practicing law, but apparently committed to rebuilding his life honorably. We exchange Christmas cards, but haven't seen each other in person since his release. Tyler completed his sentence 8 months ago and moved to North Carolina, where he's working construction and slowly paying restitution to his victims. He calls occasionally awkward conversations where we both struggle to find common ground between the boy he used to be and the man he's become. Garrett, who received the shortest sentence, was released 15 months ago and surprised everyone by enrolling in a seminary program. He plans to become a chaplain serving elderly populations, describing his calling as a way to spend the rest of his life making amends for the harm he caused. His letters suggest genuine spiritual transformation, though I've learned to be cautious about believing in my children's redemption until their actions prove their words. The divorces that followed their arrests were finalized years ago. Stephanie remarried quickly, moving to Florida, where her new husband's family provides the social status she's always craved. Courtney returned to her maiden name and moved to California, where she works for her uncle's property management company. Jasmine disappeared completely after Garrett's release from prison, leaving no forwarding address or contact information. I've often wondered what our family might have become if Harold and I had recognized the warning signs earlier, if we'd intervened when our sons first began prioritizing money over relationships, possessions over people. But Margaret reminds me that we can't save adults from the consequences of their own choices, and that enabling bad behavior isn't love. It's fear disguised as compassion. The financial security Harold protected through his careful planning has allowed me to live comfortably while supporting meaningful work. I've traveled more in the past 3 years than in the previous 40, visiting friends scattered across the country, taking tours focused on history and culture, rather than luxury accommodations. I've discovered that I enjoy traveling alone, making decisions based purely on my own interests and timeline. 6 months ago, I met Robert Thompson at a conference on elder protection in Denver. He's a retired federal prosecutor who lost his wife to cancer 2 years ago and now volunteers with organizations fighting financial crimes against seniors. We've developed a friendship based on shared values and common experiences, and we're cautiously exploring whether our connection might evolve into something more. Robert understands that I approach new relationships carefully, having learned that people aren't always who they pretend to be. But he also appreciates the strength that comes from surviving betrayal and choosing justice over convenience. We laugh together, work together on foundation projects, and share the comfortable companionship of people who've lived full lives and know the difference between love and manipulation. The letters I receive from foundation clients remind me constantly that family financial abuse affects thousands of families across the country. Adult children who view aging parents as obstacles to inheritance, spouses who drain joint accounts before filing for divorce, grandchildren who manipulate grandparents into signing over property or assets. Each story breaks my heart and strengthens my resolve to continue Harold's work. He spent his final months fighting to protect one family, ours, from the consequences of financial crime. The foundation extends that fight to hundreds of families, providing resources he wished had been available when he realized his own sons had become criminals. I've learned to forgive my children for the pain they caused Harold and me, but forgiveness doesn't require forgetting or enabling future bad behavior. Forgiveness means releasing the anger that was poisoning my own healing while maintaining appropriate boundaries with people whose choices destroyed our family relationships. The Harold Jenkins Foundation has received inquiries about expanding to other states, and I'm considering whether to pursue that growth or focus on deepening our impact in Ohio. At 67, I have energy and resources for significant work, but I'm also mindful that the foundation needs sustainable leadership that doesn't depend entirely on my involvement. Margaret Walsh recently suggested that I write a book about our experience, arguing that families facing similar situations need guidance from someone who's navigated the legal and emotional complexities of reporting family members for financial crimes. The idea both appeals to me and terrifies me, requiring me to revisit painful memories while potentially helping people I'll never meet. This morning, I received a letter from Garrett describing his seminary studies and his volunteer work with nursing home residents. He wrote about elderly people whose children rarely visit, whose families view them as burdens rather than blessings. His letter included genuine insight about the loneliness and vulnerability that financial predators exploit, and specific ideas for foundation programs that might address those needs. For the first time in years, reading Garrett's words reminded me of the sensitive, thoughtful child he'd once been. Maybe prison and spiritual exploration have helped him rediscover values that wealth and privilege had obscured. Maybe he's genuinely committed to spending his life making amends for the harm he caused. Or maybe he's simply learned to write more convincing letters during his incarceration. I'll probably never know for certain which version of Garrett is real, and I've accepted that uncertainty as part of the healing process. I can hope for his redemption while protecting myself from further disappointment. I can love the memory of who he used to be while acknowledging the reality of who he became. Tonight, I'll water Harold's roses and remember the 43 years we shared before cancer and criminal children complicated our love story. I'll review foundation applications from families who need legal assistance to recover from financial abuse. I'll return phone calls from other widows who've discovered that their late husbands protected them from children who'd planned to steal their inheritance. Tomorrow, I'll testify in a court case where a daughter is attempting to gain conservatorship over her mother's assets under false pretenses. The Foundation's legal team has evidence that the daughter forged documents and manipulated medical evaluations, and our testimony will help protect an 85-year-old woman from becoming homeless while her child lives in luxury. It's meaningful work that honors Harold's memory while helping people he never met but would have wanted to protect. It's also work that requires constant vigilance against the impulse to trust people simply because they claim family connections to their victims. I've learned that love doesn't require enabling destructive behavior, that protecting someone sometimes means allowing them to face consequences rather than shielding them from accountability. Harold understood this when he contacted the FBI about our son's crimes, choosing justice for their victims over loyalty to children who'd betrayed his trust. The Foundation's success proves that one person's courage to report family financial crimes can prevent hundreds of other families from experiencing similar devastation. Harold's documentation didn't just protect my inheritance, it provided a roadmap for other families facing financial exploitation by relatives who've lost their way. As I finish writing this story, I'm struck by how completely my life has changed since that awful day when my sons excluded me from Harold's funeral. I've gone from being a victim of family manipulation to an advocate for elder protection from financial vulnerability, to security from isolation, to meaningful community connections. I'm not the same woman who stood outside that law office clutching a manila folder and hoping for justice. I'm stronger, more discerning, less willing to sacrifice my own well-being for people who don't value my contributions. I'm also more grateful for genuine relationships, more protective of my time and energy, and more committed to using Harold's legacy to help other families avoid our painful experience. The roses Harold planted bloom more beautifully each year, and the foundation that bears his name grows stronger each month. Our sons may have chosen paths that led to federal prison, but Harold's values of justice, integrity, and protection for the vulnerable continue through work that reaches far beyond our original family. I think Harold would be proud of what his sacrifice accomplished, not just for me, but for hundreds of families who now have resources to fight financial exploitation and rebuild their lives with dignity. He may not have been able to save our sons from their own greed, but he saved me from becoming their victim, and his legacy saves others from similar betrayal. That's a form of redemption that transcends family boundaries and transforms personal tragedy into community healing. Before I close, I want to ask you something important. Have you seen signs that an elderly family member or friend might be facing financial exploitation? Are there changes in their financial habits, isolation from family and friends, or new helpers who seem more interested in their assets than their well-being? What would you do if you discovered that someone you trusted was stealing from a vulnerable relative? These situations require courage to address, but silence enables the abuse to continue and escalate. If our story resonates with you, please share it with others who might benefit from understanding that family financial exploitation is more common than most people realize, and that speaking up can save lives and preserve dignity. Thank you for listening to Harold's story and mine. I hope our experience helps you recognize that justice, even when it's painful, serves a purpose greater than individual family loyalty. Sometimes protecting the people we love requires holding them accountable for the people they've chosen to hurt. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, subscribe to receive updates about elder protection resources, and share our experience with others who might be facing similar challenges. Together, We can build communities where financial exploitation is recognized, reported, and stopped before it destroys more families. Thank you for your time, your attention, and your commitment to protecting the vulnerable members of our communities. May you find the courage to choose justice over convenience, truth over comfort and protection, for victims over loyalty to perpetrators. Until we meet again, take care of yourselves and the elderly people in your lives. They deserve dignity, security, and protection from those who would exploit their trust for personal gain.